So hello, I'm Kay Winke. I'm County Member 50. I'm also on the board for the Prairie Enthusiasts. There is a handout that orients you to what the Prairie Enthusiasts is. Our speaker today is Melinda Knutson, and somewhere I lost my phone with all my notes. Melinda, Dr. Melinda Knutson, she's a doctorate. She used to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has done a lot of research and writing and you name it, all nature-oriented things. She now runs a consulting service because she retired from Fish and Wildlife. And she has a consulting service called Trillium Consulting. If you're interested in somebody helping you, and she'll talk about maybe that as well. And she's also on the board of the Coulee region of the Prairie Enthusiasts. So she does, like some of us in the world, have passion for prairies, and she's going to talk to you today about that passion and how we can all help preserve and restore prairies in our area. Melinda.
Do you need to do something here?
I don't think so. Okay.
Just make sure the thing works.
The tech person is making sure everything works.
All right. That should be good.
All right, good.
Well, welcome. Thanks for coming out on kind of a rainy afternoon. So I'm going to talk about prairies, as you probably heard. So the things I'm going to talk about are what is a prairie and why should we even care about prairies. I'm going to give you a little history of the Driftless Area, kind of deep history that talks about why we care about prairies. In a nutshell, this area prior to European settlement was dominated by prairies and savannas. There weren't all the woodlands that we have here today. And I'm going to talk about planting natives and how that benefits bees and butterflies and birds. A little bit about some tips if you're going to plant a prairie in your yard or in a small public space. And there is a handout here that has, you don't need to take notes because those notes are already summarized on that handout that has the pretty pictures on the back of plants.
And I will tell you the prairie out here in the front of the library is an example of a prairie.
Yeah,
planting.
of a prairie planting, right. And there's some other handouts over there, so feel free to take a look at those when you have a chance. And then I'm going to encourage people to join the Prairie Enthusiasts or any other organizations in the area that are promoting the natural world and the integrity of the natural world. So what is a prairie? So a prairie is a grassland, usually dominated by native grasses and flowers. So it makes it different than a pasture, which is almost all European grasses. A prairie would have native plants in it. And this is a picture of the prairie areas in the United States and northern Mexico and actually in Canada. You can see that our western half of the US is actually dominated by grasslands of various types. And they would have historically been native prairies dominated by their own kinds of species. So we are part of the tallgrass prairie. And out in the Dakotas, for example, you get into the mixed prairie, and then in Western Dakotas, you get into the shortgrass prairie. So there's a couple different kinds of prairies. One that we focus on a lot and the Prairie Enthusiasts focus on a lot are the remnant prairies. So these are remnants of those original prairie communities, plant communities that we had. And then we also have, which isn't coming up here, very interesting. The bottom half of the slides are cut off. But anyway, the other thing is a planted prairie. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those. So what we are doing in a lot of places is planting prairie, like they've done around the library here, with a mix of plants, native species, that in some ways try to replicate those native remnant prairies. But the native remnant prairies are much more diverse than we can ever replicate with a planting. So who cares? Why do we care about this? One thing I just mentioned is that the prairies and savannas were the dominant land cover in this area, in the Driftless area, prior to European settlement. A lot of people don't realize that. When you drive around and you see all the woodlands, you think it's always been that way. That is not the case. A lot of these areas were open, and I'm going to show you some slides that'll demonstrate that. Prairies help hold the soil, so therefore they protect water quality. They store carbon, mostly in their roots. They're beautiful. People like to look at them. And they support native pollinators and birds. So there's probably a lot of other things, but those are kind of the major things. And here's a picture of a painting, actually, of the root systems of prairie plants that illustrate how deep those roots go. And you can see the roots are sometimes 2 or 3 times deeper than the height of the plant itself. So if you think about the plants that are around the prairie here, think of them going way down into the ground. And that's where all that carbon is being stored. And that doesn't disappear if the prairie, it has a fire or dies in the wintertime. All that stored carbon is down there in the ground. So I want to give you a little bit of a history of the Driftless area and show you some paintings by George Catlin. George Catlin, let me find my notes here, painted some of the most iconic scenes of the Midwestern USA in the early 1830s when he traversed both the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. These are the earliest known illustrations of the Mississippi River, and several of them portray the Driftless area. And this is what he described in his notes. The traveler, this is a quote, "The traveler in ascending the river will see but little of picturesque beauty in the landscape until he reaches Rock Island. And from that point, he will find it growing gradually more interesting until he reaches Prairie du Chien. And from that place until he arrives at Lake Pepin, every reach and turn in the river presents to his eye." Could I get some water? I'm sorry. "A more immense and magnificent scene of beauty and grandeur. From day to day, the eye is riveted in listless, tireless admiration upon the 1,000 bluffs which tower in majesty above the river on either side and alternate as the river bends into countless fascinating forms." So that could have been written yesterday. And that was written in 1841 after his trip down the river. I'm gonna wait until I get some water. I should have brought my water bottle in from the car. Well, we'll proceed here. So to fully understand why some of us care deeply about prairies, you need a history lesson. The British remained in control of the lands that are now Wisconsin until the War of 1812. In 1824, which is now 200 years ago, Native Americans still owned the Driftless area. Interaction with Europeans and Americans focused primarily on trading furs. However, the US government wanted control of the land, and in August of 1825, thousands of Indians from Wisconsin tribes gathered in Prairie du Chien, and federal officials engineered a general treaty of peace. More than 70 treaties were negotiated with Wisconsin Indians between 1804 and 1854. These negotiations soon transferred nearly all of Wisconsin to US ownership. In a single generation, under the pressure of overwhelming military force, people who had lived here for centuries or millennia lost their rights to their native lands. Thank you so much. They were coerced into moving west of the Mississippi River or confined under reservations. In 1832, the Sauk and Meskwaki Indians traveled east across the Mississippi River and fought against being removed from the area. This culminated in the Black Hawk War, a massacre by the US Army and Illinois militia. Of 1,200 people, including men, women, and children who joined Black Hawk, only about 150 survived, trying to retreat west across the Mississippi River. By 1836, Wisconsin finally had a large enough European population to be a territory, a necessary step towards statehood. Henry Dodge was appointed the first Wisconsin territorial governor, and 12 years later, in 1848, Wisconsin became the 30th state to enter the Union. So Native peoples had lived here for over 10,000 years. And they managed the land by hunting, harvesting, farming, and they burned huge areas, usually just about every year. And fire suppression has changed the landscape from a prairie and savanna dominated to agriculture, urban areas, and woodlands. They burned large areas to maintain grasslands. Because then the land supported deer, elk, and a host of native plants that they used for food, medicine, and religious purposes. Farther west, the fires maintained the bison herds. The land and water were essentially their grocery stores, mostly self-sustaining with a little help from fire. 200 years ago, still under Native American control, the Driftless area was dominated by prairies and savannas with woodlands primarily along the rivers and the north-facing slopes. This is a picture of he traveled down the Missouri River, and this is the bluffs burning. And this, even though this was painted along the Missouri River, the similar things was happening along the Mississippi River as well. This he sketched on his 1832 Missouri River voyage. The prairies burning form some of the most beautiful scenes that are to be witnessed in the country, and also some of the most sublime. Every acre of these vast prairies being covered for hundreds and hundreds of miles with a crop of grass, which dies and dries in the fall, burns over during the fall or early in the spring, leaving the ground a black and doleful color. Over the elevated lands and prairie bluffs, where the grass is thin and short, the fire slowly creeps with a feeble flame, which one can easily step over. Where the wild animals often rest in their lairs until the flames almost burn their noses, when they will reluctantly rise and leap over it and trot off amongst the cinders, where the fire has passed and left the ground as black as jet. That's written in 1841. It's letters and notes from Catlin. So this is Madame Faribault's prairie. It's someplace above Prairie du Chien. So the European settlers were frightened by these big fires, and fire suppression quickly ensued. And this is the case today as well. Unfortunately, in our climate, the absence of fire, woody vegetation quickly takes over the grasslands. We get too much rain on average to discourage the trees. With European settlement came farming, cities, roads, fire was suppressed, and the woodlands began to recolonize most areas not under cultivation. But as late as the 1940s, those south and west facing slopes were still largely open prairies because they are so hot and dry. And because the Native Americans did all that burning, we still have remnant prairies, usually on south and west facing slopes of our bluffs. We call these goat prairies. George Catlin painted many scenes of the upper Mississippi River based on his canoe trip from the Falls of St. Anthony in Minneapolis to Dubuque in 1835. In the following slides, I want you to see how bare the hills are in the Driftless area. So I'll just show you a few more slides. This is down by Dubuque. And again, you can see how bare the hills are. This is a painting of Crosse in 1867. And again, you can see, I guess you can't really, but you can see the bluffs are very bare with just a few little trees on the tops of them. This is Genoa, Wisconsin in 1907. And again, now that you can see that the trees have started to encroach, but there's still pretty large areas of prairie on those hills. This is my grandfather with my three cousins in Spring Grove, Minnesota in the 1940s. And the reason I'm showing it is if you see the hills behind them, those bare bluffs were inland as well. They weren't just along the Mississippi River, but they were all over the Driftless area. So the current restoration that we do with the Prairie Enthusiasts and the Wisconsin DNR focuses on trying to enlarge and restore some of those remnant goat prairies. And this is Rush Creek across the river from Lansing. I'm sure if you've driven down that way, you've noticed how different that area looks. Wisconsin DNR manages this land, and they've done a lot of restoration, burning, removing of juniper trees and things like that. Our remnant prairies are repositories of biodiversity with plant and animal species tuned to one another in complex and sometimes mysterious ways. Grasslands have moved around North America for hundreds of thousands of years as climates changed, growing mainly where rainfall limits the growth of trees. These timeframes are long enough that plants and animals have had time to co-evolve, which means that many native insects can only reproduce on certain plants. This is especially true for our native moths and butterflies. But unlike many rare things, it's possible to grow more prairies and more moths and more butterflies. In the driftless area, our unique topography has resulted in remnant prairies on many, if not most, steep and southwest facing slopes. Termed goat prairies or hill prairies, these open grasslands are remnants of our ancient driftless landscape. People are only recently coming to recognize the importance of restoring and protecting these biodiverse patches of land. And the hills here are Rush Creek, and they host rare habitat for timber rattlesnakes, lizards, and many other plants and animals. Friends of the Blufflands do similar work in Blufflands surrounding La Crosse. And so I was surprised, when I first started learning about goat prairies, that we actually have lizards in Wisconsin, and they live on some of these steep goat prairies. This is Jim Regala, who is currently the president of the Prairie Enthusiasts. And this is his land that he purchased outside of Rockland, Wisconsin. And I helped with a burn on this property. And so one way we manage those remnant prairies, this is a remnant prairie, top of a bluff that he owns. And I think is also under a conservation easement with the Prairie Enthusiasts. And that's how we do a lot of the management, removal of junipers and other brush that isn't supposed to be there or shouldn't be there in the densities that it is. And then we follow up with some burning. Native prairie plants are incredibly resilient. It takes only removal of the overstory, some controlled burns, and the wildflowers will bloom again. These plants have often been surviving just barely in the understory, waiting for the sun to shine. And even if the plants have succumbed to competition, their seeds may remain viable in the soil for decades, ready to reestablish the plant community when optimal conditions return. It can be quite astounding how quickly after this kind of a restoration, these rare plants show up in these habitats. So some of the species you'll find on in these goat prairies are Henslow sparrows, Bell's vireos, bobolinks, stick thistles, timber rattlesnakes, six-lined race runners, pickerel frogs, regal fritillaries, towy skippers, gorgone checker spot butterflies, wild indigo dusky wing and hickory hair streak moths, prairie bush clover, brittle prickly pear, Hill's thistle, dragon wormwood, white camas, small skullcap, and dotted blazing star. And many of you probably have never heard of any of those species. So they're really interesting places to visit. Tractor plowing was one reason for the demise of the prairies because over thousands of years with those deep roots, the prairie ecosystem built incredibly rich soil in the Midwest. Where did all that rich farmland come from that we have? It came because those areas were prairies. European farmers settling in the Midwest were quick to recognize the economic value of those prairie areas and found ways to plow up as much as possible. In short, the prairies were largely plowed under in just a few decades. Consequently, a second focus of the prairie conservation is reconstructing or planting prairies, usually on former cropland. And some of you have had experience with doing that. The US government has subsidized landowners, primarily farmers, to set aside steep or unproductive farmland for many years under the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. In more recent years, the CRP program subsidizes the planting of prairie grasses and forbs, or flowers, on CRP. Although, as I mentioned, you can't replicate the diversity that you would find on some of those remnant prairies. So here's an example again from Jim Regala's land. This was a hayfield when he purchased the property, and he has planted a prairie and restored it there. So that's not a remnant. This is a restored prairie here. One of the tragic events of this decade is the near demise of the monarch butterfly. This is a butterfly species that prior to the year 2000, everyone over 5 years of age could recognize. And most of us who are over 50 can remember when the monarch butterflies were very, very common. Now scientists are concerned that this species could become extinct. It's been proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act. which is almost unbelievable that a butterfly that was that common across most of the United States is now, we're concerned about its being extinct. One consequence of using Roundup Ready corn and soybeans is the eradication of the milkweeds from the ag fields, leading to a crash in the monarch populations. So even though we plowed up most of the available, tillable land in the United States, before we had Roundup, there were weeds growing in those fields. I myself grew up on a farm over by Houston, Minnesota, and I spent every June hoeing milkweeds. Wouldn't kill them. You couldn't kill them, but it gave the corn long enough time that the corn grew up and the milkweeds didn't really compete very much with the corn. But every year in the same place, I hoed those darn milkweeds. Well, Roundup, milkweeds are very sensitive to Roundup. So consequently, we don't have Roundup in our fields anymore. And that really has led to this, to a crash in the monarch populations, which is one reason why we're trying to plant milkweeds everywhere we can think of. Because they're not likely to recur in the farm fields anymore. But they have done research and found that when there are milkweeds in a farm field, the monarch butterflies are more productive inside those farm fields than they are anywhere else, including planted prairies and other places. So one advantage of these restored prairies is they can occupy quite large areas. They're farm fields, so it could be 40 acres or something like that. Whereas these remnant prairies are usually quite small. So they're highly diverse, but pretty small. And they can't really, a remnant prairie, you can't make more of a remnant prairie. You can only plant a restored or a planted prairie. Okay. So now we moved on to the part about what you can do. And planting native plants in your yard or public space is something you can do, and you can plant milkweeds. I wouldn't recommend planting common milkweeds in a little tiny garden because it'll take over. But there are other milkweed species that aren't as aggressive as common milkweed. And common milkweed is great in a larger area, like one of these planted prairies, larger planted prairies. Yeah.
Are pretty much any milkweed okay for monarchs?
Pretty much, yep. The monarch butterfly only reproduces on milkweeds. And so that's the true of a lot of these species of moths and butterflies that we found is that some of them will only reproduce on a certain plant. Carner blue butterflies are endangered species, little tiny blue butterfly. And they only reproduce on lupin, native lupins. There's a lead plant moth. They only reproduce on lead plant. And so there's a lot of these relationships that have been built over thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of years that cements these things together. So one species that is endangered is the rusty patch bumblebee. It's federally endangered. And this map over here is from March. It's the most recent March 2024 map showing where this bumblebee is still being found. And there are surveys and there's bumblebee surveys that are being done. But you can see that the Midwest, and particularly our area, is a holdover. So we are really important for supporting the rusty patch bumblebee. And it turns out that they will be found in like a little garden that's next to your house, or somebody in La Crosse found one in those plantings around the McDonald's. So they don't require some wilderness area. It's just an example, but many bumblebees and other native bees are in decline. Probably because of all the pesticides that are being used. So that's one reason why we're trying to plant prairies as well. So why do bees matter? So this little graphic on the right side says about 85% of plants need a pollinators, mostly bees. And more than 100 crops are pollinated by bees in the US. And okay, thank you for telling me that. But now this doesn't.
Press OK.
Let's see. Huh.
Here. Oh, it's a little weird.
It's like our screen share just went down. Okay, where's my mouse? There you are.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just curious about the remnant versus the restored prairies. Small.
Mostly small.
Is that because that's?
Well, the goat prairies are small because they've been encroached, by woodlands that surround them because we don't use fire anymore.
But if you use fire, it's.
You can make them larger. Yeah, you can enlarge those goat prairies in the Rush Creek picture that I showed you. But it's expensive. I mean, it's hard work. Those goat prairies are like this. You have to hire a contractor to do the work. Although the Prairie Enthusiasts, I have volunteers that do some of that work, but it's tough work. So it's expensive, and then prairies that are not. There are remnant prairies that aren't goat prairies, like there are sand prairies along the rivers, some of the major rivers in Wisconsin, Mississippi rivers, and some of them are still there because they didn't grow very good crops because they're sandy. But the deep tall grass prairies are mostly gone because they were great places for agriculture, towns and cities, roads. So anything that was flat has been either put under the plow or under a city or a road or something like that.
And some of the remnants out away from the bluff areas are in an old pasture that wasn't plowed up.
I'll go backwards. Yeah, okay, works. Yeah. So the point I'm going to make here is that everybody thinks that honeybees are the solution, but really native bees are much better pollinators than honeybees. And one reason is there's so many different species of native bees, and they have different lengths of their tongues. And so they can pollinate different kinds of the species because of that diversity. So here's a quiz. How many species of native bees do you think we have in the Midwest?
30.
1,000.
Okay, we got 30, 1,000. Any other? Any other?
250.
I saw 250. I think I heard 400. We have about, so whoever said 400 was correct. About 350 to 400 species of native bees in the Midwest. Each state has a list, but it varies, And there's about 4,000 species in the United States. So that's so much diversity that those native bees can do a lot of good in terms of the pollination. This is the life cycle of the bumblebee. So what happens with the bumblebee is they let's start down here. During the summertime, number 3 is the summertime. And that's when they have their little colony, usually in the ground. And then in the fall, they produce queen cells, and those queens are mated. And then only one bee survives, or I should say one queen survives to establish a nest the next year. And they bury themselves usually in like a rodent hole or something like that. And that's where they overwinter. And then they come out early in the spring and they look around for pollen and they start to lay their eggs because they were bred in the fall. And so from one queen, you get a little colony of bumblebees. So that's the generalized life cycle of the bumblebee. So what does that mean for us in terms of how we want to do restoration? We want flowers that will bloom from early spring to late fall because those bumblebees are out really early in the spring. And then these queens that are just mated, they are out into late fall, looking for enough pollen to keep themselves through the winter. Also, stick piles provide nesting and wintering sites. So don't be too tidy around your house. Have a little wild zone if you can. I know that's hard if you have a small lot in town, but if you live in the country or on the edges of town, there's often places where you can create a little stick pile or, tolerate a little bit of messiness, basically.
Would that be an open area or?
Both. Yeah, I don't think it really makes that much difference. The other benefit of prairies is that they benefit birds, and they provide food, nesting sites, shelter from predators, especially grassland birds. And grassland birds are one of our most needy sets of birds. There's a lot of declines in grassland birds, largely because a lot of things have been converted to agriculture. And they used to be able to survive in the hay fields, but now the hay fields are cut really early in the spring before they have their nests are completed. When I was young, they would often not hay until mid to late June, and that allowed some of the grassland birds to get a nest off before the hay was cut, but that doesn't really happen anymore. So this is a graphic on the right, is just seven simple things that the American Bird Conservancy says you can do for birds. And I just want to point out that native plants and avoiding pesticides are two things that private landowners can do that will benefit the birds. So native plants are breeding sites for moths and butterflies, both prairie plants and trees and shrubs, which I didn't know that either when I first started learning about this stuff. So what happens is that they lay their eggs on those plants, they turn into caterpillars, and baby birds eat mainly caterpillars. They've done research on this, and they've found that, I can't remember, like the chickadee needs 10,000 caterpillars or some large number of caterpillars in order for their nest to succeed. So that's another reason why the birds are benefiting from our native plants, because they will provide breeding sites for these moths and butterflies. Doug Tallamy has written a number of different books, if you haven't, and his book is on that handout that I mentioned to you, but those are great books if you want to read and become motivated to rewild your yard. And he's done some of the research about the how many caterpillars are needed to raise a nest of young, and how many species of caterpillars are on some of our native trees and shrubs. And one thing he mentioned in the book that I read, maybe, I don't know, quite a few years ago now, was if you don't believe me, go out and look at your yard, and the plants that you have that are not native, there won't be any holes in the leaves. And if you go out and look at your native trees and shrubs, there's all kinds of holes in the leaves. And because those native moths and butterflies mainly are eating those leaves and reproducing on them. And usually it doesn't kill the plant. So it's just a relationship that's developed and is not harmful to the plant itself. Even those milkweeds, the orange milkweeds, what are they called? Butterfly weed. I've had monarch butterflies, entirely caterpillars, eat the entire plant. It's like completely gone. And you think, oh, they killed it, right? And then they fly away, they create a chrysalis somewhere, fly away, and the plant, puts out all its new green leaves again, like nothing ever happened. Yeah, so it's amazing, really. All right, so if you've read Tallamy's book, you'll know the answers to these questions. So let's start with trees and shrubs. What do you think are the best trees and shrubs that support the largest numbers of native moths and caterpillars?
Oaks.
Oaks, all right, somebody's read the book. Besides oaks, what other ones? Cherries, he's read the book too. All right. Oak trees, believe it or not, support 534 species of native moths and butterflies. So we often think of the oak as the queen of the forest because it has so many benefits for wildlife. But cherries, willows, birches, and poplars are also, and just about any native tree or shrub will have some number attached to it. Okay, these are the plants in your prairie that support a lot butterflies and moths. Goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, Joe pie weed, even the lowly sedges support 36 species of native moths and butterflies. So when you're planting your prairie, you're supporting all these different things. So I just want to go through, just to summarize then, what helps birds. Native plants will provide the best food for your birds: berries, seeds, bugs. If you have a yard, water baths or a fountain or ponds will also attract birds. And one other thing I didn't mention is that there's stopover habitat for those birds that are migrating through the area. They will feed on those native caterpillars, and their timing of that migration corresponds to certain kinds of emergence of certain kinds of caterpillars. So that's what they're feeding on, is caterpillars and other insects that are on your plants. And then avoid pesticides, because if you think about it, if you're putting your pesticide on some bug or another, and then the bird comes along and eats it, you're poisoning the bird as well. What can you do to help pollinators? Again, avoiding the pesticides, especially things called neonicotinoids, which are systemic, which means if you put them on the ground and it goes into the plant, all parts of that plant, including the pollen and the nectar, are poisonous. They're often used on roses. I used to have a lot of roses. I got rid of most of my roses because the only way to keep them looking healthy was to use this chemical, and it's poisonous to birds and bees, or to bees especially. Again, select a mix of plants that bloom from early spring to late fall. Learn to love those bees. I don't destroy a bee nest in my yard unless it's right where I'm going to step. Or if you have little children, I can understand that, but I don't have any little children at my house. I just put one of those orange flags at, where, if it's in the yard, I put the orange flag there, and that tells me and my husband, just don't go over there and walk around. So, become a little more tolerant, I think, of having some bees in your yard. Again, leaving the sticks, leaves and stick piles as habitats for nesting and overwintering bees. And then a lot of the native insects will actually winter in the hollow stems of those native plants. That's where they overwinter. So if you burn them or cut them down early in the spring, you're actually cutting down next year's production. And I know if you have to burn a prairie, you have to burn it. Usually when we burn our prairies, we don't burn the whole area. We cut it into sections and we burn only part of it, which leaves a refugia for the other plants, other birds. So I'm only going to do a couple of slides. This could be a whole hour's lecture on how to plant your prairie and all that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of tips on that handout that I kind of squeezed onto one page. And even on the back of it, there's some planting examples that are from Prairie Moon. I stole them shamelessly from Prairie Moon Nursery. But if you wanted to plant a little prairie in your yard, you could actually use one of those to come up with a list of plants, and you can get them from Prairie Moon or from any other of the native plant nurseries. So one thing is to try to select plants that are native to your county or your state. So sometimes they sell native wildflowers, but if they're from Texas, they're going to be pretty aggressive in our kind of, more moist habitat. So try to get natives that are local. If you buy from reputable native plant nurseries, and Prairie Moon, Prairie Nursery in Westfield, Wisconsin, there's a Shooting Star native seeds from Spring Grove, Minnesota. Ion Exchange is down by Harper's Ferry. Those are the main prairie seed companies that I would recommend. Select the right plant for your shade and moisture conditions. So do a little bit of research. And again, on the back of that, Prairie Moon has done that work for you, and they, say this will work in a shady site and this will work in a full sunny site. Avoid aggressive plants, even if they're native. So the common milkweed is one I would avoid in a small, tiny area. And quite a few of the goldenrods, even though they have a lot of habitat value, goldenrod a number of different species of goldenrod will take over pretty quickly. So just be careful about that if you're planting a small area. Also, a common thing that people do is they plant plants that are too tall, and then they flop over their walkway or whatever. So plant really short plants next to your walkways if you don't want to have to trim them off, cut them off. If you want to get them going quickly, plants or plugs will get a pretty garden faster. Seed will take 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years before it starts to look like the way you think it should look. Of course, seed is cheaper. Plant in drifts. Try to plant like species similarly together. They recommend that because the insects don't have to hunt around. They can get everything they need in sort of a small area. Mulch heavily and weed in the early years. You do have to weed once you've started. If people say a prairie is no labor at all, that's not really true. You do have to do some weeding, especially in those early years. And if there's some invasive plant, get those out of there as soon as you see them, because once they become established, they're very difficult to get rid of. And what about non-native flowers that you like to have? Hydrangeas or whatever. I mix them into my flower gardens. So I have things that flower a lot that I like. And in your own yard, you can mix those things together. That's not a problem. If you're trying to create a native prairie in a larger area, or you want it to be pristine, then don't put a lot of non-natives in there. But in your own yard, you can mix and match them. It doesn't matter. Early care. If you plant seeds, you want to keep the area mowed short for the first 2 years. Prairie plants will spread on their own. So if you have them planted here, and you got it all nicely mulched, and you think it's going to stay that way, it won't. Some of the plants, they'll seed themselves out and spread themselves all around, and eventually it'll look like an English cottage garden. So just be aware that that's how prairie plants are. So you have to learn to love disorder a little bit. A prairie garden is not going to look like, another kind of more formal type garden. And if you have some new species that you want to get started in there, you can interplant either with plugs or sometimes with seeds. And again, get those invasives out of there right away. If you have an established prairie, burning is really the best way to manage those. Usually after like 3 or 4 years, you start to burn. That's if it's legal to burn in your area. So you'll have to check on what the rules are and follow the rules. But burning every 2 or 3 years, if it's allowed, is a great way to manage your prairie. It keeps some of the woody vegetation down, and it creates places where prairie seeds will survive over quite a few years in the soil. So everything you planted in that seeding doesn't come up right away. It might come up 5 years later. And the prairie plants are about this big the first year, might have 2 leaves. So you can't see them very easily. And most people can't identify them. So anyway, you have to be patient if you do seeds, is I guess the point. And my last message to you, I guess, is just to keep learning. Learn to be a naturalist. You'll never be bored. There's always something to learn. There are great phone apps now that can help you identify plants, identify birds by their song. I mean, it's amazing. I'd like to do a little presentation about phone apps because they really have revolutionized your ability to learn how to be a naturalist kind of on your own. I think I had something profound to say about that. What was it? Oh, so, prairies kind of inspire, creativity and so here's a poem written by John Rigdon, a friend of mine from La Crosse. And then many of you maybe know Gary Eldred. That's a drawing that he had in our Prairie Promoter, our magazine that we have. How to get involved. There's lots of different organizations, but today I'm going to promote the Prairie Enthusiasts because this is a prairie talk. Mississippi Valley Conservancy, I have some handouts from them over there. If you have some areas that are have more woodland and things like that, they will do conservation easements, and there's some tax benefits to that. The Prairie Enthusiasts now also do easements, and they would be focusing mainly on prairie areas. Valley Stewardship Network is right here in, well, actually, Prairie Enthusiasts and the Valley Stewardship Network, their main offices are here in Viroqua, so probably most of you know that. And they do a lot of work in the Kickapoo watershed, and do water quality work. And then if you want to get involved at a state level, Wisconsin's Green Fire is sort of an advocacy group for conservation, natural resources conservation. How many of you have taken one of the trips that the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin does? One person. Those are fabulous. So you should, I think that's on that list there, but Google the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin, and they have like 300 field trips. They're usually a Saturday or a Friday or something, and they're like usually 2 or 3 hours long, but they're led by people from the DNR and other people very knowledgeable. They're on natural resources, archaeology, all kinds of things. My husband and I usually try to do 2 or 3 of those a year. And the money, the people that lead these trips are either volunteers or paid by some other organization. So all the money goes to support the Natural Resources Foundation. And the foundation helps, like the DNR, pay for new picnic tables and maybe upgrades to buildings on state parks and other public properties. So they're a great group. They also do international trips. So you can go on an international trip and with a lot of Wisconsin people. That'd be kind of fun. Uh-oh. So this was my profound thing I was going to tell you. Anyway, it was a quote about Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and I can't remember it verbatim, but basically the land ethic is about caring for the land, and that we all have a responsibility basically to try to care for the land, just like we would care for our relatives or our neighbors or our friends. So, make the land your friend, I guess, is basically, that's not what he said, but that's my interpretation of what he said. Uh-oh, more, okay, so in closing, the plant, the pollen, the bumblebee, and the weather are all engaged in an intricate dance that we humans are only dimly understand. In a world that seems increasingly broken, at risk of climate change, species extinctions, and unsustainable agricultural practices, rewilding even small areas with native prairies supports birds, pollinators, helps preserve the ecological heritage of the driftless area, and is ultimately a labor of love. So thanks for coming out.
Did you want to play the video?
Oh, the video. I forgot about this video. Okay, so yeah, if you want to see a video of the bumblebees working gentians, it's just very short. It's not very long. And this is similar to like I get a little chair and I sit next to my gentians at my house because they are so entertaining. The gentian has a flower. There's a blue gentian and a white gentian, and they have a flower that never opens. The only bee that can get inside the gentian is the bumblebee. And so they struggle and struggle, and the gentian has a lot of nectar down at the bottom of that plant to attract those bumblebees. So there is a
What Prairies to the what services they provide, and
so the Prairie Enthusiasts are pretty much what I said. They're enthusiasts about prairies, and I don't know exactly how long they've been around, but quite a long time. And it was started by a few people. Like Gary Eldred was, I think, one of the founders of the Prairie Enthusiasts. And one of the main things they provide now is they will come out to your property. They've hired a botanist who's fabulous, Dan Carter, and he'll come out to your property and take a look at what you've got and help you decide if, you know, what restoration you might want to do for that property. The other thing is the people that are part of that can decide to volunteer to help other people. So some of the landowners found that they couldn't burn by themselves, and hiring a contractor to burn is very expensive. So I think originally these were landowners that had prairies that wanted to come together and help each other. And so there's a few people that have taken the extra training to become burn bosses. Jim Regala is one of those people. And they will schedule certain burns to be done during the year if you're a member of the Prairie Enthusiasts.
All right, give me one more second.
They have these work days, and I've been on a lot of them, and I think the advantage of the work days, you go to one of the prairies that they own or manage, and it's a great way to learn about prairie plants and about invasives and all the things that you can do in your own property. It's a really good learning experience to go on some of their work days that they have. And there's
Did it work or no?
there's a
No.
prairie, the nearest prairie to Viroqua actually
It's
is
not a big
Iris
deal. It
Drive,
doesn't
which is near Gates Mills. Just a little bit south of Gates Mills. Actually, Bob is the site steward for that prairie. So that's the closest one. Right?
That's what the closest.
Yeah.
Southern County does not have any TPE sites. per
Yeah,
se.
Vernon County does not own any sites or manage any sites in Vernon County at this point.
I can play the video. I just can't get it on Zoom. I think that's the
Okay.
problem.
So maybe just tell the people on Zoom that you didn't have, that didn't
One
work.
thing I
Alrighty.
get out of it is exercise, rather than going to the gym, I'm out working on the prairie, and, you know, I like going fishing and hunting, but you go into a boat landing and you gotta be a launch fee and the parking lot's packed. Go to a TPE site, you got it all to yourself. So it's kind of nice in that respect.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop screen sharing then here for our Zoom so we can play the video. It's just not working with both. So thank you all for joining us here online. Appreciate it. And have a good rest of your day.
There's that.